We'll skip through the little activity, but the whole premise is we have stories to tell, and I want to encourage folks to um, put their story out. And in the end, especially for the folks who are looking for the logistical ways to start things like Nick, there's going to be an equipment list. And then also for the folks editing, I have recommendations for what software to use to get started. We'll skip this. Just a little bit about me. Born Philippines. There's Nate. Got the Rock the School Bell Scholarship while I was at Skyline, so I love Skyline. I was part of the PCN class for a minute when I was there as well. So I very much love KLC, PCN. Graduated last year. Transferred into UC Berkeley, did social welfare there, and I do creative work such as music, and I'm focusing on organizing here in Daly City, connecting restaurant owners, entrepreneurs, and the Filipino community. So there's a Filipino garage. I'll just go over quick little industry standard of podcasts, why the work that I do I think is important, and the work that y'all will do starting your podcast is important. If you look, this is the iTunes podcast store, so there's a lot of podcasts. I usually do listen to them when I'm driving, walking the dog, things that I don't need active thinking for in a way, folding clothes, and maybe like if I'm doing a construction project, I'll listen to a podcast. So it's actually very highly consumed in my own life. That's why it's also a great way to reach people, because people are doing these things, and it's gone down during the quarantine because consumption was really high during commute. So a lot of the people who would listen to the podcast would do it on the drive and tell me that's the case. But the main premise is create it now and let it live, and it will be consumed in the future. For context, as of this year, there's around 900,000 podcasts. So the creation is getting high, but then there's a roadblock of how will you get it to the listeners' ears. For the podcast consumption, if we look at like Twitter, it's around 20%. The highest consumption rate of social media platforms is still Facebook and YouTube. But one of the rates is that it's being used more than 20% of the time for people in different age brackets and in terms of recency. So it's a platform that is increasing in consumption, rivaling like Twitter. And it's something that is easy to get into once you have the basics, right? So I did look over the script that was sent over, and I'll give some examples of what they call scripted podcasts versus the free form podcast that I did with Janice. One thing, this is just to show you the amount of money in the podcast world. The major earners last year, for example, Joe Rogan, 30 million. My favorite murder is actually a scripted podcast. They made 15 million. These others are kind of interview things. But what I was pointing out during the RTDSB presentation is that it's mostly a white male industry right now in terms of the podcasts that are being created and who is making most of the money. That is why I do encourage folks of different backgrounds, whatever that is, to create your podcast so the content is out there for people with similar backgrounds as you. Because, for example, even in NPR, majority is white folks, and these are also in terms of hosts, right? So moving forward from the numbers, we don't have to do that. This was a little activity. Shout out Kim, another Skyline counselor. And so I'll go into okay. We'll go into just my podcast. Oh, look who's that. That's Professor Janice. Okay, so this is the podcast. I've been running it for 2 years. I started it because I listened to a lot of podcasts. Joe Rogan Experience #1. But throughout that time, I did not see any Filipinos on there. And the conversations I would have with some of my friends were really dope. And I was thinking, hey, like, I want this to be seen and heard by other people because I get a lot from podcasts myself. I would love to have other people get positive things out of our stories in the Filipino community as well. So that's what I do now. We're at like 42 episodes. It's a little on a hiatus right now and kind of a pivot because I like doing the podcasts in person. A lot of folks are now transitioning to online interviews. I just haven't really gotten the vibe off that. And what I'll share is that in creating podcasts, the real fundamental is doing something that is relevant to you and then getting the technical skills to build it. But it's only going to be really effective and long lasting if you like doing it yourself. So I'm not pushing to do interviews in that way online because I just don't like doing it. But so far we got a range of guests. This is the little table that is available on the website for you to see who they are: rappers, educators, students, community members, different range of backgrounds. That's what I like doing. This is one of my favorite aspects of it, is the performances. If I just play this. This is Rudy Kalma.
Yo, yes, yes, sir.
Local musician based out of Sacramento.
Let me get this right.
Also,
yes, sir.
Spent a lot of time in Daly City. So this is my setup also.
I've been in my zone, I've been patient, I've been knocking down my obstacles for sure. I've been training, I've been humble since I'm mopping up the floor. Put my money where my mouth is, always fighting out my ball. Slowly see familiar faces.
Okay, so it bounces. So this is actually one of my favorite aspects of the podcast is I get to see performances from poems, rappers, singers, and I'm a big fan of a lot of the people I've had on the podcast. So on a selfish tip, the podcast is also for me because I get to have dope conversations with folks that I respect. In terms of a framework that was kind of asked like why I do it, I want to kind of give a shout out to this book, Coming Full Circle by Lenny Strabel. She's a Filipino-American psychologist and academic. And in this book, she says, Filipino-American students need teachers who will understand their experience, who will make needed resources from non-traditional sources available. And the idea is that we got to put ourselves in positions of power and influence so that those coming up can visualize themselves in that position as well. She was talking about teachers in her example in the book and educators, but I also believe the same principle applies to entrepreneurs, business leaders, community leaders, all that. So what I wanted to do was to create a platform for folks to see the examples of other successful and incredible Filipino Americans so that they could see the possibility of themselves excelling as well. And because while I also have non-Filipino role models in that sense, there's a certain level of impact where the person looks like me and I can envision myself in their shoes and they have similar background stories of immigration and things like that. In the intake form that I have, I actually asked similar questions of like kind of a little mini survey of how much they relate to their ethnic background, how much it's been impactful to have people who look like them as role models, things like that. So now is more of like the logistical steps. I actually share this as a, what is called, I created a little resource page that I'll share with y'all afterwards. So you don't have to worry too much about taking specific notes or forgetting the resources. If you see, I'll be sharing, let me exit this. I'll be sharing this guide with y'all afterwards, which has it all with the link, so we can not worry about taking notes right now, but I'll send that all. But first, in terms of the larger theory, I would break it down into 3 stages: the strategy, production, and then distribution. But the main idea is to get out a product as soon as possible. In business, they say minimum viable product, because then that will give you kind of that beginning feedback on what's working, what isn't. For example, in your case, maybe you do one scene from the PCN and test that. So you don't have to think that you have to edit and produce the whole PCN all at once, because that's a big project. That's a lot of editing, but you can do one small part and then test it out, see what people think, get the things that's working, increase that, and take away the things that is not working. So first I'll say about strategy. This is also more so for folks who are thinking of starting their own podcast. It's better to have the strategy up front about what kind of podcast you want, instead of kind of putting something out and then changing it, because that's what I did. And while it's doable, you can be more efficient if you do this. The things that I like to think about is how long your podcast is, whether it's a short or a long one. Mine averages around 2 hours, but the ones that I listen to on the daily are like 15 minutes. If you're going to do it daily, weekly, if it's going to be an interview, group discussion, if you're going to have one guest or interview a whole group of people, if you're going to do a scripted one, like a structured, edited one, or like what Janice and I did, where it was a free-flowing conversation, or also if you're only going to do audio only or video also. For Nick, who was talking about you don't have the video camera, I wouldn't let that be a roadblock to you starting one, because a lot of the consumption actually for podcasts are audio, and then they use the video for additional consumption. So that's one thing to think about. Some examples is this Robin Hood Snacks is a daily podcast that's put out 15 minutes. It's all about the stock market. And while Joe Rogan is like 3 hours long. You have different podcasts where these No Chaser podcast with Timothy De La Ghetto, big YouTube star before, and it's 3 consistent hosts versus Tim Ferriss is just 1 host and different guests. So you see different setups work for different people. I don't want you to think that there's one gold standard of how a podcast should be run. Up first is a daily podcast. Gimlet is this one I'll put in the resource for you to listen to, because it's basically how to create a podcast. It's like 3 episodes. They talk about pitch, editing, how to do an interview. Great kind of how-to podcast to listen to. And there's only like 6 episodes that stays forever there. That's what they call a scripted serial podcast. And that could be something that the PCN podcast can look like, where it just stays there. It's not something you necessarily update all the time. Maybe it's a yearly thing, right? For form, we have scripted here, and then this is a free-flowing. But Dan's Hardcore History, this guy does like 3 hours, multiple sessions of going into history. Like he talks about the Wrath of the Khans, about Genghis Khan, and does a whole well-researched story about it, where he gets primary text, reads it, but it's kind of free-flowing. For what y'all might be interested in, this long distance podcast is run by a Filipino American and is well edited, scripted, in the sense where she does interviews, takes snippets of them, edits it in with music and all that to kind of tell a story. So if you're trying to do that with a PCN, I would say that this is where you would look for, because it has that edits of musical themes and transitions. So these are kind of good things to look at. Think of what you want to do beforehand, and then get your first minimal viable product, first example out as soon as possible. I was told about I was asked how I get my guests. Really, it's all just in-person network. Majority of these folks are people that I know, that I like, that I follow on Instagram first. I've had some people reach out to me that they want to be on the podcast, but what I do is I follow them first on Instagram and I kind of catch their vibe. Usually, if I don't like their vibe, I'll be like, nah, let's not do it, right? I've had a few folks where they wanted to be on, but I just didn't catch it for whatever reason, and I just didn't have them on. But if there's someone I follow and I really like, I'll reach out to them, mainly actually through Instagram. Here's a message I sent to Janice. Hey, Janice, hope all is well. Just blah, blah, blah. I'd love to talk about your poetry. And the idea really is relationship building. Sometimes it's more formal. Sometimes it's informal. Like, bro, need you on the podcast, brother. And then this dude, MC Zuko, for those who are into rap, is great. We did like an impromptu mobile setup when I was in LA for like 2 days. I was like, yo, are you available? So there's opportunities there. It's really just about relationship building, and then seeing who you vibe with, who you authentically can have a conversation with, and who you're interested in. If you are doing a interview podcast, if you're thinking about that, I highly encourage checking in with yourself that you're getting someone that you actually want to learn a lot from, because that's where the gold of a conversation comes from. When if it's just like, let me get this person on for clout because they have a big following, it's not really the most organic and great conversation. But if you have that real honest desire, it can be great and beautiful. So let's go production. I broke it down into cheapest, mid, and full setup. Honestly, you can get started with just your phone. Your voice memo is really good, and or any other recording app, but you'll want to get this little lavalier microphone. If you record straight from your iPhone, it catches the room noise. So this room that doesn't have that much echo, but then if you're in a room which has reverb, ambiance, it's going to echo a lot and it's hard to listen to that. What will help are these little mics. And you can actually get like a 2 with a splitter, 2 mics for like $25 off Amazon. You do not have to get fancy with the equipment, since really you're just going for vocals. What you'll be looking for is making sure you're recording at a level that does not have distortion. Usually you just control that with the volume input on your phone so that the recording does not peak, and so that you'll be able to adjust the volume of it later once you're in your DAW, which is your audio editing software. If you have a little bit more money, if there's institutional funds, maybe from the school or some form of doing that, I would suggest you try to go mid-mobile. The mid-tier, which can really work well as a mobile setup. This little Zoom, around 250 or so, can take in 2 different mic inputs. So that's direct and that's high quality audio, right? It's a little, you can kind of tell it's better than the iPhone, but honestly, you're gonna get good when you're just doing vocals on the iPhone. This little mid-mobile setup, this is actually industry standard to catch live performances, to if you want singers, if you want to double up. If you're thinking about broadcasting in the future, like Christian, or audio editing, audio production, if you're thinking about doing music in the future, this could be a nice little mini investment to get that, because you can record guitar through this and all. And it's very mobile. This is what I used to record the homie MC Zuko when I was traveling in LA, because you don't have to have this plugged into anything. For a full setup, it's definitely up to 300 plus, because you'll have multiple mics and your laptop, computer, and this little audio interface is what they call. But this is what I've invested in because I record music, I've recorded albums on here, interviews, and it's what I have at home, right? But I'm just showing you these 2 just so you can kind of see the upper scale. But honestly, to get started right now, the phone with this little lav mic is A1 perfect, more than enough. Right? What you'll want to focus in on is editing. And the idea is there's a lot of editing software out there, Pro Tools, Ableton, Logic, GarageBand, Audacity. But the whole idea is to find something that will work with your workflow, the most minimal workflow, minimal learning curve for you, so you can focus on the content creation and the editing. What I will say is that if you're on a Mac, you should have GarageBand. This is highly recommended just to get started. iPhone, you can get it there also. And you can get good quality and comparable products because you are just using your vocals mainly and some audio backing tracks, right? So I'll just drag in, for example, can you see this, right? This is basically GarageBand. You can do little edits with the audio out like this, and then it's just and then you add in and cut your audio, right? So we'll cut it there, and then you'll be able to move this around. The whole idea behind this is just you'll be focusing on these things called compressing and limiting. All right, these are just the super basic things. I won't go into it now. I could do like a little tutorial for folks who they decide is going to be your editor if you want. But there is also just a wealth of information on YouTube for the basic vocal correction when it comes to compressing and limiting. And this is the thing with GarageBand. It's already included in the software itself in terms of plugins. Just to show y'all, what I actually use is Pro Tools, and actually I don't have it open. And the thing is, this is a super expensive, what's this called, DAW. But if you are interested in editing in the future, if you're doing interviews for your job, Pro Tools is basically the industry standard. But there's also another one called Reaper, which is $60. So I listed it all in the resource page, so don't worry about the taking it down or remembering. But know that there are entry-level positions for you to develop your skills for a career if you want to, but you don't have to worry about that if you're only going to edit right now for basic audio vocal release for a basic podcast. If you're on Windows, there's Audacity. Everybody will recommend you this. This is super basic, but what like I said, the main thing you're going to focus in on is sequencing, putting the music where it has to be, cutting, moving things together, compressing, bringing the loud vocals down and bringing the soft vocals up. That's what compressing means. And then limiting, which means you're taking the balanced audio and bringing it up to an industry standard. Industry standard right now is around -1 dB. So that's all kind of that's like the basics of audio editing in like 5 minutes. But you'll be able to, it's a little confusing at first getting into it, but it's very easy once you get that first learning curve tackled, because all the concepts kind of build on each other. Okay, distribution, hosting, for those starting, I would tell you to go on podbean.com. You get up to 5 hours free for a month. Every month you get 5 hours free, and that's just free totally. Versus others, there's a lot of limitations. I've already gone through all the free hosting options. This is a good one, and Anchor, which is accessible on your phone, is also a good option. This is a honorable mention. But in terms of all the options that I've looked around for long term is podbean.com, because you can build on this platform for free. And if you decide you want to pay for some reason, multiple shows, or to see advanced analytics, you can upgrade within the platform. But I would say you do not need any money for hosting to get your things onto Spotify or iTunes, things like that. Podbean is free and good enough. If you want to do it yourself, these are for the folks who are into learning how to host a website, things like that. WordPress is an option. For example, this is the one that I use because I host my own website on a hosting platform called DreamHost, and then I just install a WordPress site and use the free Blueberry plugin to integrate podcasts into there. So this is just something for you to look into if you want to go into hosting your own website in the future. And this keeps costs down because I'm basically unlimited with storage and bandwidth space and all that. Next thing is marketing. So the idea is you put it out, but you also need to get eyes on it. That is why, like what Isa was saying, she's seen clips on Twitter or on Instagram. You create little snippets. And then this is what I do. I create little audio.
It was one of my like I would call it like my weakness slash like insecurity. But now I think of it as like my strength.
So to build the intrigue and to get people interested in different avenues, right? Twitter, Instagram, but also different types of media forms. And then I just link everything to a link tree so everything can be accessible, whether Spotify, YouTube, and or directly to the new episode. Landing page where everything is just accessible in terms of a website. Sorry if this is also getting just a lot of information, but this is what I gave to when I did a consult for this other organization. It's just good to see the different platforms on creating a project and letting it be known to other people, because a lot of people create content, but it's not accessible. And if it's not seen, then the value of it remains hidden. So I really encourage creating as many platforms as you can so that the people you want to reach can reach it. I was asked about what a weekly routine looks like. This is what I was doing based on when I was in the full mode before quarantine as a weekly thing. I would release one episode, then start mixing the next one within the week. And then during these times, I'm marketing the previous episode, then I'll release the new one. Then I'm kind of recycling, right? Record, mix, listen, upload, write the info on each website and market. And yeah, so basically that's just the crash course on it. If you want, the link is bit.ly/Kuya Pod Guide. This has the resource page for you, so you can see all the information that I was talking about, where the links to each tier of the equipment is there. And then there's the vetted resources for your audiograms and for hosting. So I'll add on to this a little bit. I just created this yesterday, but this will be the working guide and resources for folks who want to learn and want to kind of create their own podcast. And yeah, I'll stop sharing now.
Wow, that was great. Can I unmute everyone? And can we also like clap and cheer and congratulate and wow. It sounds louder with the echo in the rooms. Wow. Okay. Wow, Christian, you went over so much. I feel like you definitely addressed all of the questions that I sent you. Everyone, for last week, if you remember, we came up with a list of 7 questions. I sent them. They're all incorporated into the presentation. And then if you all want to ask very specific questions about anything that we just heard, now would be a good time. Time check, it's 3:10. We at least have until like 3:25 or 3:30. So I definitely want this to be like your time. So please feel free, ask whatever you want to say and share.
I have questions. Do you ever do, when you have like guests, do you ever do like Instagram stalking or like social media stalking?
Yes, especially those who are creative. And so I pull up all of their pages, Google, everything. I research as much as I can because it allows for me to kind of dive deep. And people appreciate it when kind of you of course, not the creepy shit, right? Not like liking a picture from all the way down, but I still scroll down, right? But it's useful because they appreciate seeing the interest in their work, and it allows me to ask the deeper questions about why they do things or what was the impetus for a certain project, rather than just kind of relying on kind of the surface level or what I might just know in that sense. So it's very helpful in that way.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question?
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, I wrote it down. So, do you often dwell on different topics that do not relate to your usual, like, criteria, I guess? Like, sometimes, let's say you want to be political, so you want to be, like, somewhere really out on the outlier. Do you ever, like, think of, like, how you want to incorporate in it to your podcast, or do you just think of it as a topic to be thought about in the future, something like that?
I don't actively like decide what topic will be talked about in each podcast session necessarily, unless it's relevant to that person's life. Because the way that it's been set up is it's more like interview chat like that, and I kind of let the conversation evolve and go wherever it goes, right? Because I always tell the interviewee or the guest that this podcast is just as much theirs as it is mine. And I always give that open, like, yo, you can say whatever you want. There's no limits. There's like, some people think that they can't cuss. I just say, bro, there's no limits to this. And it kind of evolves from there. So that's where sometimes the conversation gets really off. Like, but it's dope because that's where it evolved from. And that's what I actually enjoy rather than necessarily sticking to set questions. But that's for me. That's how I like to operate and how I like to have the conversation. But I've seen other people do well in terms of like having topics that they want to address. But I'll only do that if it's all relevant to that person, or if I purposely brought them on to be like, oh, he knows more about entrepreneurship. Let me talk to him about entrepreneurship. Or if my cousin that was actually mentioned by Chevy, about the U.S. Army Reserve coding, he does coding in LA, and I was like, this will be a great podcast for like software engineers, entrepreneurs, things like that. So I'll bring up topics if it's relevant to the person and the conversation and how it evolves in that way.
You.
There's a question here by Michael. If we're doing like a theater podcast where we produce, perform PCN itself, how should we record our audio? Recording the audio individually and then editing them together, recording everything together as a group. Definitely individually. That's why the program like GarageBand allows you to have multiple tracks. That's why the equipment that I suggested was like the Zoom H4n allows you to record multiple different inputs and it's saved as different files. Even the way that I record here is each vocal is its own different file because each person speaks at a different level. So I have to compress that differently and then match it so that the final product has everybody at the same level. So those are the minute details in terms of editing. You'll want to edit if you want to record like a scene, you definitely do it one by one speaking. Or, I mean, if it's like them talking over each other, yeah, you can do that simultaneously, but each with a different audio input. So one person has a phone running and a mic, and another person has a phone running and a mic, so that you can adjust the levels afterwards. It's easier to adjust different files than one combined file in the end. So that's what I'll suggest there. And definitely a room with not that much echo. You'll want to record the background noise separately. That's what they call Foley in film terms, is any sound effects like this, walking, that's called Foley, and then, or room noise, like an electric fan, things, you'll record that separately, then layer that into the video on GarageBand, on your audio editor, mix the levels so that it sounds natural. But you're trying to record a dry sound as possible for vocals so you can edit all that afterwards.
Other folks? Questions?
I had one, but I lost it. It's working. Hold on.
It'll come. Big brain. Remember, you always say that.
Big brain. Oh, have you ever done a podcast where like you would have like people comment on like Twitter, like, can you help me with this? Kind of like asking, like giving them tips on like, how do you do this? Because I don't know, if this is your first time like sharing your story, or if this is your first time like kind of like sharing with us how you made your podcast. So I was wondering if there was ever someone like that asked you a question. Were you responsive in the podcast, or were you responsive in wherever based like, question they asked? Like, let's say if I asked a question on like Twitter, did you answer it on Twitter or did you answer it in your podcast?
So I actually bring up a lot of like things I see or talk to on Twitter in the podcast, but I don't necessarily like at them in the podcast. What I do is I use the social media platforms to test. Like I told you all about the minimum viable product, right? And making little shifts. So for example, I'll use the poll on Twitter and Instagram to ask, what kind of length podcast do you more enjoy? Or do you want the podcast released on Monday or Friday? Things like that to test with the audience themselves and then use that as feedback. Like I shifted my release schedule from Fridays to Mondays because of the feedback I got from just my network on when they would like to see a podcast. Right. So since you've already got an engaged audience, those supporting you, things like that on those platforms, it can be very helpful to get kind of quick answers that you can test. That's what they call A/B testing. If you try something and then measure its results. Right. Yeah. Ooh, I saw you are using Notion. Cool. Is it okay? Notion templates? Yes, I can share some. I don't have that many templates, but I'll share with you that Notion is really great for organizing information. Like, for example, I organized a resource guide for Daly City for COVID. So basically, this is available publicly, and it lists the Filipino-owned restaurants in the area, any other resources within Daly City for safe food Bay Area. I suggest people check into Notion if you want something to kind of organize your thoughts, shareable, things like this. I use this to organize my podcast, bullet schemes for the website, things about this. I don't really have templates, but if you have specific questions, let me know and I can help with the training or something to help use the program if you want.
All right, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Since we're gonna do an episodic podcast, so because basically what we did is a theater play, then the idea was adapted from so it was a theater play, and the idea was to transform it to a radio play, and then we got into podcasts. So do you have any suggestion or tips on how or anything we should change for to our script so that it could make a good storyline or so?
I wouldn't say necessarily change. I would just think about how you're going to structure it for the podcast, right? If I just share my screen one more time as a quick example, I know you've seen this. You've pretty much seen this arcs rising and falling, right? But I know this is for the whole PCN. I want you to also think about that for each episode. Because what will work, I think, is multiple episodes, shorter snippets, which has the rising and a falling and a little cliffhanger in the end, instead of one long radio show or one long podcast, because that's not really the consumption method of podcasts right now. There are some in terms of the serialized podcast, like the true crime ones or murder ones, but they focus on one story in each episode. And majority of them are not long. I know the podcast, I know PCNs usually last maybe 2 hours like that. I know you're taking out dancing and all that, but I would suggest you see where you can cut the story into maybe 6 different pieces and then have this rising and falling and a cliffhanger lead in to the next episode, and let that kind of simmer in folks' minds so that they're looking forward to the next episode at a set date. And then that could be the incentive to listen to it again. So that's the only change in terms of a whole podcast. You'll want to look into how you're going to portray actions, whether that's going to change how people say things, if there's a narrator or not, or if you're going to go with sound effects instead, right? To convey certain actions, right? Because I know how a script is usually written with scene settings, right, on the top, right? That could easily become a narrator if that's the case, or it could just be dialogue that change it, that's more descriptive and more action oriented in terms of how the dialogue is portrayed. If that makes sense. I'm not a big theater person, so I've forgotten. Sorry.
No, that's great. I think that's great. That's exactly the Plot Mountain storytelling arc that we used when we were writing our PCN last fall. So I'm glad to see the same information come back around.
Yeah.
I have a question. Or does someone else want to ask one? I had a no. Okay. I just wanted to ask for Christian, how do you create community with other podcasters? I too. I don't know if I Instagram stalk, but I just try to stay up on everything. And I noticed that you've gone to conferences. I noticed that when you drop a new episode, I noticed a change from Friday to Monday. So what are the ways that you currently build with other specifically Filipino, but other podcasters?
For me, I'll say I'm not necessarily the best at that because I'm low-key shy when it comes to reaching out to people I don't really know, right? If I know folks, I'm like, I've planted the seed and I start that relationship. But what has been helpful is, like you mentioned, attending the podcast conventions, right? But to be honest, at the podcast convention, there was not a lot of people of color there also. So it's a different vibe, but I'm able to build. But what is helpful is more so putting myself out there and people reaching out to me. So I used the podcast in this class that I attended, Art and Activism. And then another lady runs an org called the Unconscious Bias Project, where they go into workspaces and teach people about unconscious bias. And then I help them with their project for the Filipino Garage. For their podcast. And then I was shouted out on and things like that. For the other people that run podcasts that I've been on, they've reached, like the one that Michael was talking about, the theater in the Philippines, they just reached out because they searched for Filipino podcasts and I popped up and then they said, hey, would you like to be on the podcast? My other homie, I know through jiu-jitsu, and he runs a podcast for in the Philippines. So things like that, that's how I was brought on. But while this is for maybe the introverts, like for me, like for example, you mentioned TFL, I'm a big fan of them. I'm just shy of like, hey, like that. I'm not, because I don't want to, for me personally, I don't like asking people, hey, can I be a guest on your podcast? I don't really like doing that. Because it feels very self-promoty and or more like leechy, versus when folks ask me to be on theirs. I'm like, yeah, sure. But I love asking people to be on my podcast. So that's just a personal thing. So, but what I would say is find what personally is relevant to you. If you are the person who likes outreaching and doing that, then you could be the lead to get people onto the podcast. What has actually worked a lot for me is my homie Joe is he is more of the extroverted one, and he puts me on people. He's like, yo, this guy should be on your podcast. This guy should be on your podcast. And then he actually tells those people, dude, Christian runs a podcast, blah, blah, blah. So there's different ways that I've gotten folks on and built that network, but it's ways that I'm comfortable with. I definitely push myself out there in terms of creating a website and putting it out there and having a platform for people to view. But those are things, that's my method, right, of letting it be known that I have this, right? Then following communication pathways that I'm comfortable with and that I'm strong with.
Wow, that's so great. And then let's see. Can I ask you one question before we go? One more question? I want to know, you mentioned that you know when you don't want to interview someone. You said when I don't catch the vibe. I wonder if you could say more about that. Like, I have an idea of what that is, but I kind of want to hear it from you.
First, it comes from what I personally view as my principles. And if I know that, then it's easier for me to see if people are on similar wavelengths based on how they post, how they write, what they post, things like that. It's kind of hard for me to explain it in other than like that energy, energy. But it is kind of like that energy vibe. Like I've had folks that I feel was more on the marketing side, like that whole thing where like they want to be on to increase the viewership of theirs. And of course, I'll increase my viewership on their platform, but I'm not really doing it. I'm not just having a conversation just because I want to increase viewership, right? I want to have a conversation with somebody that I'm really interested in and I vibe with, and that's just how I run the podcast in that way. And to be honest, there have been some people who I've had on the podcast and we've had falling out in that way. So it's not like it's perfect, but that's just how life is, right? And I'm just grateful. I keep it respectful all the time. But that's the thing I have also learned is you can only do your best. You can't please everybody. And that goes with the creation of a podcast, right? That's why I really believe in niche demographic content creation and marketing, because you don't have to please everybody, but you can just create something that's relevant to yourself and to your community, and the viewers will come, the supporters will be there, and the people who want to support will support in that way. So it boils down to that authenticity, which comes with reflection and self-awareness and with time and work, right? And mistakes, right? You get the lessons when you make mistakes too.
Oh, wow. Okay, we got 2 questions that came in the chat. Can I ask you these quickly too? The first one, and maybe this is in reference to your Kuya Pod guide. Do you have websites on there for free sound effects or affordable sound effects?
No, but there's, I used to use them for music and stuff. There's a lot. If you just Google free sound effects, but I'll add on to that. I'll add on to that. For ones that what you're looking for specifically are quality audio files in terms of usually WAV, and also like relevant usable ones. You'll want to look for, in terms of backing music, the term that you want to look for is quote unquote royalty free music. And those usually pop up, because the thing with music, especially once you put it on YouTube especially, is that their algorithms match it up really quick. So it can mess up your workflow if you put something on there, even if it's an instrumental, and it gets matched, and then you have to delete it, and because it'll block it. and then you have to remix the whole thing. I've had to do that multiple times with even some podcast episodes, because I would just pull off an instrumental. Even if it's just an instrumental of another song, old song, it'll be matched quick with their algorithm, and you'll have to take that out. The term royalty free, of course, it's a legal term, but also majority of those won't get you flagged in terms of background music on YouTube or SoundCloud or any other platform like that. Right now, just to note, Spotify and iTunes don't really scan the audios that much, but if you do go onto YouTube, things like that, or especially Instagram has it built in already, it'll match them, and you'll have to delete it.
Okay, that's super important too, so that, you know, the entire episode doesn't get taken down, or like you said, it doesn't create more or less work for you. Last question from Marianne. Have you ever deleted a podcast or not put it out?
Yeah. Like, I think there were two, but there wasn't anything wrong with the conversation or anything, but one of the guests, he got worried about the content he was sharing because of his work. In terms of like, he was like talking reckless and dirty stuff and like explicit. And then he was worried that his work might be mad at it for some reason. But other than that, not really. Sometimes I would not put the person's full name, like that's, so it's not Googleable. But for the most part, no, not really. But that's where I would also share. I had a little picture of it in terms of the intake form, which had the survey. But that's why it's also important, if you are having guests, to funnel them in properly and orient them in properly in terms of, it's going to be on these platforms. Do I have your consent to post it, and get that in writing, and also to let them know also that this is open podcast, that you can say whatever you want, share whatever you want. There have also been moments though where during the podcast we'll start getting into something, but then if I notice that they don't want to talk about something, I'll be like, yeah, it's okay, bro, you don't have to talk about it, right? And letting that also be known. So knowing when to ask deeper questions and also knowing when to step back is very helpful. And that emotional awareness when you are interviewing someone or having a conversation with someone.
Thank you. Thank you. That was so great. I feel like we just took a master class with you. That was so helpful. Everything from the background and the statistics and like just like why it is necessary for us to create podcasts. Last week, people shared podcasts they wanted to create. Someone said podcasts about car community. Someone said skincare. Someone said mythology. I have a whole list. Artwork, right? Like I really hope and I can see that we all do it. And I think that your guides are definitely going to help us as we create our PCN podcast. So this means a lot. I'm really happy that you took the time to be with us while you're at the beach, or like I said, like I look at your Instagram, so I know you just built a mini deck for your yard. Yeah. So yeah. I'm really thankful. Can we all, I'm going to unmute everyone one more time. Can we like clap or, say hello?
Thank you, Beatrice. No problem.
Yeah. Thank you.
My laptop died.
Oh, yes.